Everyone at the Model Aircraft Club knew Raymond as the patient instructor. 80 years old, steady hands guiding radio-controlled planes, teaching children the physics of flight with infectious enthusiasm. But when mysterious aircraft appeared on radar screens and prohibited zones, the humble hobby teacher transformed into someone the FAA never expected, revealing 35 years of experience tracking hostile aircraft that threatened American airspace. Raymond Theodore Mitchell was 80 years old, with white hair that had thinned to silver wisps and alert gray eyes that could track multiple aircraft simultaneously while calculating wind speeds, approach angles, and flight patterns with the precision of someone who had spent decades monitoring skies where mistakes could cost lives. The Riverside Model Aircraft Club met every Saturday morning at the Community Center in suburban Denver, where a large parking lot provided enough open space for radio-controlled flight training without endangering people or property. The club attracted families who wanted their children to learn about aviation, retirees who enjoyed the technical challenges of building and flying model aircraft, and hobbyists who appreciated the precision required to control something through radio signals rather than direct physical manipulation. Raymond had volunteered as chief flight instructor for 14 years, arriving early every Saturday to set up safety cones, check wind conditions, and prepare training aircraft for students who ranged from 8-year-old beginners to teenagers pursuing private pilot licenses. His teaching style combined technical accuracy with patient encouragement, making complex aerodynamic principles understandable to children while maintaining the safety standards that kept model aviation accidents extremely rare. Now, Sarah, remember that when you pull back on the elevator stick, the plane climbs. But climbing too quickly will cause a stall, where the wings lose lift and the aircraft drops. The key is gentle, smooth control inputs that work with the physics of flight rather than fighting against them. These Saturday lessons represented more than hobby instruction. They were introductions to the scientific principles that governed all aviation, from paper airplanes to commercial airliners. Raymond took pride in watching children develop understanding of lift, thrust, drag, and weight while learning to think three-dimensionally about movement through space. The club members treated Raymond with the affectionate respect reserved for volunteer educators who contributed expertise far beyond what their positions required. His knowledge of aerodynamics impressed parents with engineering backgrounds. His safety consciousness reassured mothers whose children were learning to control aircraft. And his patient teaching style helped nervous beginners develop confidence in their ability to master challenging skills. What none of them realized was that Master Sergeant Raymond Mitchell had spent 35 years using identical principles to protect American airspace from aircraft that carried hostile rather than educational intentions. Raymond lived alone in a modest ranch house 10 minutes from the community center, a comfortable, single-story structure that he'd purchased with military retirement benefits and maintained with the precision that characterized everything he approached. The main living areas reflected practical tastes rather than decorative ambitions, furnished with pieces that prioritized comfort and function over style. But the converted garage workshop revealed technical capabilities that exceeded model aircraft construction requirements. The space contained precision tools for machining aircraft components, electronic equipment for testing radio frequency systems, and reference materials for aircraft identification that covered military and civilian aircraft from dozens of countries. Workbenches held partially completed projects that demonstrated expertise in material science, aerodynamic design, and electronic control systems. The walls displayed photographs from another life. Military installations where young men in uniform had worked alongside radar equipment that tracked aircraft across thousands of miles. Air defense sites where split-second decisions determined whether unidentified contacts represented threats that required immediate military response. And ceremonies where Raymond had received commendations for service that protected American communities from dangers they never knew existed. And in a secure filing cabinet that seemed excessive for model aircraft documentation were credentials that would have transformed how the Denver aviation community views their volunteer instructor. Air Force specialty training in radar operation and aircraft identification, NATO certifications for tracking Soviet aircraft during Cold War surveillance missions, and consulting agreements with aerospace companies that had developed the civilian air traffic control systems currently protecting American skies. Master Sergeant Raymond Mitchell, United States Air Force Air Defense Command, 35 years operating radar systems that detected aircraft hundreds of miles away, identifying friend or foe signatures that determined whether contacts represented routine civilian traffic or potential threats requiring interceptor response, and coordinating with fighter squadrons that protected North American airspace during an era when hostile aircraft regularly tested defensive capabilities. His specialty had been long-range aircraft identification and threat assessment, understanding how different aircraft types appeared on radar displays, recognizing flight patterns that indicated hostile intent, and coordinating defensive responses that balanced air traffic safety with national security requirements. Raymond could examine radar contacts and determine aircraft type, probable mission, and threat level based on speed, altitude, and maneuvering characteristics that civilian controllers might miss entirely.
The career had taken Raymond from early warning stations in Alaska, where he'd tracked Soviet bombers testing American defenses, to NORAD facilities, where he'd helped coordinate responses to airspace violations that could have triggered international incidents, to training assignments where he'd taught younger technicians to recognize the subtle signatures that distinguished routine aviation from potential threats. Retirement in 2003 had been voluntary rather than mandatory. Raymond had accumulated enough military service to retire with full benefits while still young enough to pursue civilian interests that didn't involve staring at radar screens for 8 hours while calculating intercept courses for fighter aircraft. The model aircraft instruction wasn't about staying busy during retirement. It was about sharing the aviation knowledge and safety consciousness that had defined his adult life with young people who might develop similar passion for flight. Teaching children about aerodynamics, control surface function, and flight safety provided the same intellectual satisfaction as military radar operation, but with educational rather than defensive purposes. The work also allowed Raymond to maintain skills that military retirement couldn't eliminate. Understanding aircraft behavior, recognizing unusual flight patterns, and monitoring airspace activities remained as natural as breathing for someone who had spent 3 decades protecting American skies from airborne threats. Saturday, August 19th started like every other club meeting. Raymond arrived at the community center at 7:30 a.m., set up safety equipment, checked weather conditions that would affect model aircraft performance, and prepared training materials for the dozen students scheduled for morning flight instruction. The first lesson was with the Peterson family, whose 9-year-old son Michael was learning basic aircraft control using a high-wing trainer designed for beginning pilots. Raymond guided Michael through pre-flight safety checks, explained how radio control systems translated stick movements into aircraft responses, and supervised the careful taxi procedures that preceded actual flight.
Remember, Michael, aircraft want to fly if you give them the chance. Your job isn't to force them through the air, it's to guide them gently and let aerodynamics do the work. Michael's first solo flight proceeded smoothly, with Raymond providing calm instruction that helped the boy maintain control while learning to think ahead of the aircraft's responses to control inputs. At 10:15 a.m., while supervising Michael's landing pattern, Raymond noticed something that triggered 35 years of air defense training developed through monitoring hostile aircraft approaches. 3 small aircraft were approaching from the northwest, flying in formation at low altitude with flight characteristics that didn't match civilian aviation patterns. The aircraft were too small for commercial flights, too coordinated for recreational aviation, and following approach vectors that would bring them directly over Denver International Airport, restricted airspace where unauthorized aircraft weren't permitted. Raymond had observed thousands of aircraft during his military career, and these contacts displayed behavioral signatures that suggested surveillance or reconnaissance rather than legitimate aviation activities. He completed Michael's lesson but began monitoring the airspace with eyes trained by 3 decades of identifying threats that civilian observers might dismiss as routine air traffic. At 10:30 a.m., his concerns escalated when the same aircraft returned, this time conducting systematic flight patterns over infrastructure targets that included power plants, communication facilities, and government buildings. The coordination, timing, and target selection indicated professional reconnaissance rather than coincidental overflights. Master Sergeant Mitchell recognized the operational profile immediately. Someone was conducting advanced surveillance of critical infrastructure, using small aircraft to map defensive positions and identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited during coordinated attacks. The flight patterns, timing, and target selection matched intelligence profiles that Raymond had studied during counter-surveillance training designed to identify exactly these kinds of threats. But Raymond's position as volunteer model aircraft instructor provided no official authority to report military-grade surveillance activities to agencies responsible for homeland security. His observations, however accurate, would be dismissed as speculation from a retired military technician whose expertise wasn't known to current authorities. Master Sergeant Mitchell faced a choice that would define his impact on national security. He could file informal reports through civilian channels, hope that current air defense systems would eventually identify similar threats through their own monitoring, and risk allowing hostile surveillance to continue while bureaucratic processes slowly address potential dangers. Or he could use 35 years of expertise in airspace defense to protect American infrastructure the way he'd been trained to do when similar threats emerged during his active military career. Raymond made his decision in approximately 20 seconds. He called the North American Aerospace Defense Command through emergency contact procedures that retained his military credentials, identified himself by security clearances that carried immediate authority among air defense professionals, and requested immediate investigation of airspace activities that indicated potential terrorist reconnaissance. NORAD operations. This is Master Sergeant Raymond Mitchell, retired Air Defense Command. I'm observing coordinated aircraft surveillance of critical infrastructure in the Denver metropolitan area. Flight patterns indicate professional reconnaissance rather than civilian aviation. Sergeant Mitchell, this is Captain Rodriguez, NORAD watch officer. Can you provide specific details about the aircraft and flight patterns you're observing? Raymond's voice carried the calm precision that had characterized thousands of similar reports during his active military career. Captain, 3 small aircraft, probable single-engine civilian type, conducting systematic overflights of infrastructure targets, including DIA, Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and electrical transmission facilities. Coordination, timing, and target selection indicate professional reconnaissance rather than recreational aviation. Sir, our current radar systems show normal civilian air traffic in that area. Are you certain these aircraft represent unusual activity? Captain, I'm observing flight patterns from a model aircraft field with clear sight lines to the affected airspace. These aircraft are conducting surveillance missions using techniques designed to avoid detection by standard air traffic control systems. Within 40 minutes, F-16 fighters from Buckley Air Force Base were conducting intercept missions that confirmed Raymond's assessment. The unidentified aircraft were indeed conducting systematic reconnaissance of critical infrastructure, using flight patterns specifically designed to exploit gaps in civilian radar coverage. The subsequent investigation revealed that the surveillance aircraft were part of a larger terrorist planning operation that had been studying defensive vulnerabilities across multiple metropolitan areas. Raymond's identification of the threat had prevented what could have been coordinated attacks on electrical infrastructure that supplied power to most of Colorado. Master Sergeant Mitchell, how did you identify the reconnaissance patterns so quickly? Asked Colonel Peterson during the security debrief. Raymond looked around the NORAD command center where he'd been brought to provide detailed analysis of the airspace activities he'd observed from a community center parking lot. Colonel, I've spent 35 years learning to recognize exactly these patterns. The flight coordination, target selection, and timing all indicated professional surveillance rather than legitimate civilian aviation. My position at the model aircraft field provided optimal observation angles that standard radar systems might miss. The story remained classified in military databases that civilian communities would never see. The prevented attacks, neutralized terrorist surveillance, and infrastructure protection all disappeared into intelligence files that maintained operational security while protecting the methods used to identify threats. Raymond returned to his volunteer instruction duties, teaching children about aerodynamics with the same patient enthusiasm that had characterized his pre-emergency work. but something had changed in his approach to airspace awareness and his understanding of how his skills could continue serving national defense. "Mr. Raymond, why do you always watch the sky even when we're not flying?" asked Michael Peterson during the following week's lesson. Raymond looked up from the control surface adjustments he was demonstrating, his gray eyes holding the alert awareness that had never quite disappeared. "Michael, aviation isn't just about flying aircraft. It's about understanding everything that happens in the airspace around us. The more you observe and understand, the safer everyone becomes." "Were you a pilot in the military?" Raymond smiled, adjusting his model aircraft club instructor badge that covered federal credentials he'd hoped never to need again. "I spent my career watching over the skies to make sure pilots like you would always have safe airspace to fly in. Now I get to teach the next generation of aviators how to be responsible for the same skies I used to protect." Raymond Mitchell continued his volunteer instruction until he was 87 when mobility issues finally made airfield activities impractical. He spent his final years consulting with Homeland Security agencies while training air defense technicians in aircraft identification techniques that bridged military surveillance with civilian aviation safety. Because he'd learned that the most effective airspace protection often required expertise that exceeded current monitoring systems, vigilance that continued regardless of retirement status, and pattern recognition skills that served both model aircraft instruction and national security with equal dedication to keeping American skies safe.